As children of God, at times we go through difficult situations where many people rise up against us even without a cause. The enemy may try to disenfranchise and dislocate us. He may try to overthrow us from our positions or attempt to destroy the reputation that we spend our lives building. Nevertheless, God has been restoring believers from ancient times, and He is able to do it for us today. Whenever we find ourselves in situations like these, we must pray like David prayed in Psalm chapter 3. We must also spend time to write down our prayers like David did so many years ago. Yet today we can find comfort and encouragement through the prayer of this same man who loved God. Now let's examine David's prayer in Psalm chapter 3 and explore the background context in which he wrote this prayer and its outcome. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people.
Psalm 3 is a deeply personal prayer of David, written during one of the most difficult and heartbreaking periods of his life, when he was fleeing from his son Absalom, who had rebelled against him and sought to overthrow his kingdom. This event is described in 2 Samuel chapters 15 to 18. Here is the background and context of the psalm.
Absalom, David's third son, staged a rebellion against his father. After gaining favor with the people, he declared himself king in Hebron and marched towards Jerusalem, forcing David to flee for his life. This betrayal by his own son was not only a political crisis, but also a personal and emotional one for David. As David fled Jerusalem, he found himself surrounded by enemies, and those who questioned whether God would help him in his time of need. His enemies mocked him, saying that even God had abandoned him. This increased David's sense of vulnerability and isolation. Despite the overwhelming opposition, David expressed his unwavering faith in God. He calls the Lord his shield and the lifter of my head, signifying God's protection and the confidence that God would restore his dignity and position. Even though David was physically fleeing, spiritually he remained steadfast in his trust in God. In verses 5 and 6, David speaks of being able to sleep peacefully, despite the danger surrounding him. This rest comes from his trust in God's protection. His enemies were many, 10,000s, but David knew God would deliver him, just as he had in the past. In verses 7 and 8, David calls on God to arise and save him from his enemies. He speaks of God's power to defeat the wicked and acknowledges that salvation belongs to the Lord. David's confidence was in God's ability to rescue him and bless his people. Psalm 3 reflects David's deep distress and the internal turmoil of being betrayed by his own son, Absalom. Despite this, the psalm is also a profound declaration of David's faith in God's protection and deliverance. In the midst of fleeing and facing insurmountable odds, David finds peace in knowing that the Lord is his shield and his salvation. It is a psalm of trust in God's protection during overwhelming adversity. Absalom's death came as the culmination of his rebellion against King David, a tragic story that highlights the theme the battle belongs to God through both the unfolding of events and God's sovereignty in bringing justice and order despite Absalom's opposition to David. How Absalom died. The battle. After Absalom declared himself king and took control of much of Israel, David's forces, led by his trusted commander Joab, met Absalom's army in the forests of Ephraim. David had instructed his men to deal gently with Absalom for David's sake, reflecting David's compassion despite his son's rebellion. Absalom's fatal capture, as documented in 2 Samuel chapter 18. During the battle, Absalom rode a mule, and as he passed beneath the thick branches of a large oak tree, his long hair became tangled in the branches. The mule ran out from under him, leaving Absalom hanging helplessly in the tree. Joab's decision. Although David had asked for mercy, Joab saw an opportunity to end the rebellion and struck Absalom with 3 javelins, followed by his men finishing the deed. Absalom's body was then thrown into a pit and covered with stones. 2 Samuel 18:14-17. His death effectively ended the rebellion, restoring David's reign. David's grief. Upon hearing of his son's death, David wept bitterly, mourning Absalom's fate despite the betrayal. His cry, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom," 2 Samuel 18:33, reveals the depth of his sorrow and the personal pain intertwined with the political conflict. How Psalm 3 aligns with the theme. The battle belongs to God. Absalom's death illustrates the theme that ultimately God is in control of battles and outcomes, even amid human conflict and rebellion. Here's how this theme is reflected in Absalom's story. God's sovereign justice. Absalom's rebellion was not only a political struggle, but also a direct challenge to God's anointed King David. By becoming entangled in the tree and rendered powerless, Absalom's death underscores the idea that God can bring justice in unexpected ways, without David himself needing to lift a hand. God intervened in a way that allowed David to retain his integrity while the rebellion was quelled. Trusting God over force. David's initial decision to flee rather than engage Absalom directly reflected his understanding that God, not human strength, would resolve the battle. By showing restraint and entrusting the matter to God, David avoided bloodshed against his own people. His heart posture aligned with the principle that victory is given by God, not by sheer power or personal ambition. God's control over outcomes. The unanticipated way Absalom was caught in the tree, and ultimately his death, highlights God's hand in controlling outcomes. Despite Absalom's ambitions and military strength, he could not escape the justice of God. This reflects Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21, which says, "There are many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand." God demonstrated that he was in control, not Absalom or even David's army. God's faithfulness to his anointed. Absalom's death also fulfilled God's promise to uphold David's reign and house, as stated in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12-16. Though David's kingdom faced many threats, God preserved him and ensured that justice was carried out on behalf of his anointed. This confirms that God's plans prevail, even against formidable human opposition. Conclusion. Absalom's tragic end and David's restoration underscore that the battle belongs to God. The way Absalom was caught and rendered defenseless in the tree illustrates God's ability to bring justice without David needing to retaliate. David's restraint and trust in God reflect his understanding that God was in control. In the end, God's faithfulness prevailed, reaffirming his ultimate sovereignty in the lives of those he has chosen to fulfill his purposes.